If the mind is identical to the brain, then it couldn't be anything else. But you can imagine the mind without the brain. Is that evidence that the mind isn't the brain? Let's consider. Hello philosophers, I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. In this video, we're going to look at the modal argument against physicalism. And in a future video, we'll look at the physicalist response in the form of identity theory. Speaking of physicalism, there's something I need to clarify before we get started. In the last video, we explored different possible definitions for the word physical. We rejected material and we rejected spatial because they exclude things that we typically would consider physical. And we went with the definition that physical is that which can be explained and described by physics. Then I mentioned physicalism. I said it was the idea that only physical things, and again, by physical I mean can be explained or described by physics, only those kinds of physical things exist. But really there are two ways in which this word physicalism is used. We could mean out of all the stuff that exists, every single thing in the universe, every single thing is physical. And if that's what we're talking about, we'll call that ontological physicalism. But we could also mean just the stuff that we're talking about in philosophy of mind, things like thoughts and desires, those things specifically, those are all physical. And if that's the case, then we'll call that psychological physicalism. In any case, we've been looking at forms of psychological physicalism. And the last one we looked at was a mind-brain reduction. Now, interestingly, the objections that we gave there were objections to the mind being seen as a material thing. However, we showed in the last video that the same problems don't necessarily go for the mind being considered physical if we mean by physical, describable and explainable by physics. So maybe now we could say that the mind is the brain, or at least that it's like a physical part of the brain. Today, we're going to look at an argument called the modal argument. It's bold enough to claim that not only is the mind not identical to the brain, but it couldn't possibly be identical to the brain. Here's what the modal argument looks like. Premise 1, a thing is necessarily identical to itself. So 2, if the mind and the brain are the same thing, then they are necessarily the same. But 3, it's possible that the mind and the brain not be the same. Therefore, 4, the mind and the brain are not the same. Now you could be excused if you don't quite understand what this argument's getting at. It sounds kind of weird the way it's put, but let me explain. First of all, premise 1 is incontrovertible. That's got to be true. And here's why. Think of a world that's exactly identical to ours. Populated with all the same people and all the same stuff. But in this world, I'm 6'2". In this world that we're thinking about, this possible world, make me 6'3". That's possible, right? I mean, it might change a few other things. I might be better in the post in basketball. I don't know. But given those, few differences that would happen if I were 6'3" instead of 6'2", that's still a possible world. So I could have been 6'3". I didn't have to be 6'2", but I'm 6'2". So the fact that I'm 6'2", that's a contingent fact about myself. And by contingent, I mean, it's true, but it didn't have to be true. Now, think of a world exactly identical to ours, but now instead of making me 6'3", make me Morgan Freeman. And I don't mean just make me look like him and sound like him and all that kind of stuff. I mean, make it so that I'm no longer Chico, I'm actually Morgan Freeman. Does that make sense? Is it possible for me to exist, but not exist as myself? Not gotta be me, or else I'm just not me. This is a necessary fact about myself. And I don't mean like I just gotta be true to myself, but the fact that I am identical to myself, that's a necessary, it has to be true. If I'm going to exist, then I have to exist as me. Now, the fact that if anything exists, it must be identical to itself, that's pretty uncontroversial. Now, 2 follows from 1. If what psychological physicalists are claiming is that the mind is identical to the brain, even some part of the brain, then because of premise 1, the mind must necessarily be identical to the brain, or necessarily be identical to whatever part of the brain we're talking about. Now, from there, things get interesting. The strategy here isn't to claim that the mind is different than the brain. That would obviously be question begging. No, the strategy here is to say that the mind could be different from the brain. That's what premise 3 is claiming. 4 follows by modal logic from 2 and 3. If you're unfamiliar with modal logic, it's logic dealing with exactly the kind of stuff that we're talking about now, necessity and possibility. So the idea is that if the mind and the brain are identical, they must be necessarily identical, but to be possibly not identical is the same thing as being not necessarily identical. That probably sounds confusing, so let me say it one more time in a little more layman terms. The idea in 2 is that if the mind is the brain, then it has to be the brain. But premise 3 claims that it's not the case that it has to be the brain. So working backwards from 3 to 2, we see that the mind isn't the brain. That's kind of the magic of this argument. Again, it's not claiming that the mind is distinct from the brain. It's claiming that it doesn't have to be the same as the brain. And then you get the conclusion that it's distinct from the brain. So it's very clever. And as I said, premise 1 indubitable. It's got to be true. 2 and 4 followed by logic. So if anything's going to be false, it's going to be 3. The question then is, do we have good reason to believe in premise 3? Why believe that the mind could possibly be different than the brain? Why believe that it doesn't have to be the brain? Let's look at 2 arguments that are usually given in support of premise 3 here, both of which have their origins in the philosopher Rene Descartes, which you've heard me mention before in this playlist, and you're going to hear me mention him again. He's sort of the progenitor of the modern substance dualist. And substance dualism is seen today as sort of the alternative to physicalism, but as we'll see later, there's actually alternatives to both of these guys. In any case, the first argument is that it's possible that the mind is different than the brain because it's conceivable that the mind is different from the brain. The argument goes something like this. What's conceivable is possible, but it's conceivable that the mind exists apart from the brain. Therefore, it's possible that the mind exists apart from the brain. And again, this is an argument used in support of premise 3 from the modal argument, and that premise 3 in the modal argument is used for the conclusion, ultimately, that the mind is distinct from the brain. Now, that first premise, what is conceivable is possible, that's something we're going to look at in a different video. What's cool about this argument is that it gives us the potential to look at some really interesting ideas. What is it that makes something possible versus impossible? But let's look at premise 2 right now. Why think that it's conceivable that our mind be distinct from our brains? Now, to me, this is the most interesting part of the whole modal argument, and unfortunately, it has the least amount to do with it, but let's check them out. The first 2 reasons to believe this are given by Rene Descartes once again, and the first one is that it could all be a dream. In a dream, you are totally deceived about all the physical stuff around you. You know, you see physical things coming at you, you interact with them, but they're not actually there. It's totally an illusion. Not only are those things an illusion, but your body is also an illusion. In fact, sometimes I've had dreams before where I'm in somebody else's body talking to my body. Totally weird. I've had dreams that I'm not even in a body, where I'm just sort of observing everything that's happening, and I see myself, my body doing stuff, and I'm sort of over here looking at it all happen. So it seems possible for us to conceive of that thinking part of ourselves as existing without thinking about the body there. But and here's the interesting part of the argument, you could be dreaming right now. Often when you have a dream, you confuse it for reality. You think that's actually happening at the time. You might have even had dreams where you really thought it was real life. You wake up and you think something's happened that didn't actually happen, that was in your dreams. Well, this could be one of those very deceiving dreams. You could be dreaming right now. And if that's the case, all this physical stuff that you see around you might not be real. It might not actually be there. But what is there is that thinking aspect of you, right? That aspect that's looking at all this stuff and confusing it with reality. So thinking about this thought experiment, we are conceiving of ourselves as a thinking being, as a perceiving being, without any kind of physical stuff, without any body there. It seems like we're conceiving of our minds as existing apart from our bodies. Now, Descartes goes on to say more about this, but I'll look at that in the second argument. We're going to look at the essential property argument. The second reason Descartes says that we can conceive our mind as existing distinct from our brain is the evil genius argument. He says, imagine an evil genius demon that can totally trick us, can make us have this wild illusion. And everything around us, we think it's there and it's not actually there. Again, we're considering ourselves existing, our minds existing, the thinking aspect of us existing, and the body not existing. Therefore, we can conceive it. This is an interesting argument, and it's typically today talked about as the brain in the vat idea, which is the idea that it's possible that I'm really just a brain that's sitting in a jar somewhere, and there are electric impulses that are causing me to have this huge hallucination. Wilder Penfield famously produced hallucinations in people by shocking different parts of their brains. Of course, the brain in the vat idea would have the drawback that the brain would still be there and still be physical, so it's not quite as reliable as Descartes' idea. Also, Hinduism and Buddhism there's some forms that believe this whole world is Maya, it's all illusion. Many of them actually believe that the mind is also an illusion, but there are some of them that believe that the mind is the only real thing and the rest of this physical world is all an illusion. So you could see, like, at least in those forms of Hinduism and Buddhism, Descartes could say they're not nonsense, right? I mean, people that believe that, even if they're wrong, they're conceiving of it, or it seems like they're conceiving of it. So it seems like they're conceiving of a mind that exists separate from the brain. A third reason you can give to think that we can conceive of the mind separate from the brain, and this isn't something given by Descartes, but I have heard modern philosophers give this, is the idea of out-of-body experiences or even near-death experiences. And I know near-death experience, that sounds very new agey. Are we really going to take that seriously? But it ends up that in this argument, it won't matter whether they're real or not. So many people report I don't know about many people. There are some people who report this formless kind of existence that they went into after some almost dying or some kind of really traumatic experience. They swear that they saw things and they heard things, but they were knocked out, they were unconscious, and they could hear the doctor saying something in the other room or something like that. They could see their own bodies from the corner of the room. Now, some people dismiss this as a fabrication of the mind. If that's you, great. Some people are very adamant on this actually happened. If that's you, awesome. Personally, I don't have a dog in the fight. I don't really care. The point here is that even if they're not real, they're at least conceivable, right? If somebody were to tell you about their near-death experience, you might think, that's ridiculous, right? Clearly that didn't happen. But you wouldn't say, wait, what do you say? I don't understand. What are you talking about? Whereas you would say that if I, for example, were to tell you, yeah, I'm not actually Chico. What, are you disguised as somebody else? No, I'm Chico, but I'm not Chico. What? I can't even think of what that means. Well, a near-death experience isn't like that, right? You can actually picture what's happening, whether or not it actually happened. So you can conceive of their minds existing apart from their brains. Does this argument work? Really, we have two questions here. Number one is those examples that we just gave, the two from Descartes and the other one of the near-death experience ones, do those really show that we're conceiving of our mind separate from our brain, or is something else going on there? And number two is what you can conceive actually indicative of what is possible? Those are two questions that we're going to look at in the next video. We'll see some possible physicalist responses to that. But now let's check out Descartes' second argument. And we can call this the argument from the essential property. It goes something like this. Everything has one essential property that makes it what it is. For us, that property is our property of thinking. Now, if thinking makes us what we are, if thinking is what we really need in order to exist, well, there's nothing in that job description that has anything to do with the body. So we can exist as thinking things even if our bodies don't exist. If that's the case, even if it's not physically possible, it's at least ontologically possible that the mind is separate from the brain. If that's the case, then premise 3 from the modal argument goes forward. Now, why believe premise 2? Why think that it's the thinking aspect of ourselves that is the essential property? Think back to the different examples that Descartes gave about the dreams and about the evil genius. In those examples, Descartes shows that we can always doubt whether the physical world exists, including our own bodies, including our own brains. We can look around and say, yeah, I mean, it seems to me like these things exist, but I don't know, maybe it is an illusion. But one thing you can't doubt is that you're doubting. You can't doubt that there's actually thought going on, that somebody is sitting there thinking, I wonder if this whole thing is real. And this is where, if you've ever heard that I think, therefore I am, this is where that comes from. Descartes says, I'm thinking right now, therefore I must exist. But think about that. If I am thinking means that I exist, then that must be my essential property. That must be what I need in order to exist. That must be what I am. Now, what about this argument? Does this argument work? Well, there are a number of different objections you could give. An objection that existentialists would give to that first premise is that there is no essential property. There is only existence. But to me personally, if you're just going to do away with properties, that just seems very implausible to me. But a second objection you could give is, why think that there just is only one essential property? Some philosophers will go for like a cluster theory and say that you could have a cluster of properties that makes you essentially what you are. I don't know if I really buy those, but at the very least I could say I want to know why there couldn't be two essential properties, two things that I have to have in order to be a human or in order to be me. I mean, I guess a ton doesn't hang on this one, especially because Descartes' real point here is that you're picturing yourself existing and none of these other things like body existing, and you're still, that's you, right? And so that's why he would say this is the essential property, and maybe other things have more than one essential property. But since we're considering ourselves and we're seeing ourselves like this existing, just thinking thing, then that's what we must be. So I can kind of see that. But then again, I also think, well, that sounds a lot like the conceivability argument. So how is this different? Final objection you could level at this one is that we don't always think. Maybe I get knocked out and I can't perceive anything. I don't think about anything. Maybe I go into a coma. I don't know. I mean, I know there are dreams and stuff, but there is at least some point in there where you're not thinking. Does this mean that we cease to exist when we stop thinking? And I think you could respond to that to say, no, as long as you have the capacity to think, then you are what you are, then you still exist. But if you're going to go that route, then the psychological physicalists are going to say, yeah, well, the brain is the capacity to think, right? That's exactly what I'm talking about. So if this is what the argument's going to be, then I think the burden of the proof is on the person claiming that the capacity to think is distinct from the brain as well. In any case, that's all I'm going to say about argument 2. But again, in the next video, we're going to look at argument 1 again and ask those two questions. Are those different scenarios that Descartes gave us, are those good reasons to think that we can conceive of our minds distinct from our brain? And even if we could, is conceivability evidence of possibility? I think that's going to be a super interesting video, so don't forget to stay tuned, check it out, and I'll see you then. Adios.